All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? Of course, we've been covering a lot of movies recently with different ideological strains. But, we haven't really covered a movie recently that is very relevant to the name of our podcast, MAO. And much less, we've not reviewed a movie that has made us LMAO. And I think, Brian, there's a movie that I know you recommended that we review recently that I think would fit very well into that, which is late 80s North Korean propaganda.
This is an interesting way to look at, because the last several episodes that we've done have all kind of been about a type of propaganda, right? It's all about something that is advancing a specific ideology.
Yes, and this advancing of ideology is that North Korean action is actually really fucking cool looking. So this week we're going to be reviewing the North Korean propaganda film Order Number 27. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Week.
Woo! Yeah! All right. And, of course, we're going to be reviewing this North Korean propaganda film. There is basically nothing to discuss in the details of the synopsis. So this week, we're going to do something that we haven't done since, I believe, the African American Psycho review, where we're going to do two different cringe millennial segments before we get into our review here. Now, Brian, of course, this is your week's episode. Do you have a cringe generational cringe millennial to talk about?
Yes, I do. So how cringe it is up for debate. I would say it is a little bit cringe, mostly based. I want to check in on, people who've been listening for a while might remember our old friend, Sean Mutagi. Do you remember Sean Mutagi?
Ooh, yes, I do. The vocalist of Vegan Reich, yes.
Yes, vocalist of Vegan Reich, Captive Nation Rising, his ska reggae band, a lot of bands. Very influential guy, kind of a controversial guy in hardcore, but I'm going to say honestly, mostly pretty based. There's some dumb, kind of straight edgy, bullshit with Vegan Reich, but mostly seems to have grown into a pretty cool guy. I think even at the time, most of his beliefs were, I think there's a little bit of a lot of straight edge puritanism, but mostly pretty advanced guy for the hardcore scene, right? So I just earlier this week, or I guess late last week, was looking over my Instagram feed and I follow Sean. I follow a lot of hardcore guys from that era just to see what they're up to, because sometimes they post funny shit and sometimes they post cool shit. Sean Mutagi posted a little thing promoting his new band, Violent Disorder, and it caught my attention because you'll remember, Taylor, that pretty recently we talked about the angelic upstarts. And so to provide context for that, we talked a bit about skinhead culture and mod culture and ska culture, just to give a little bit more context for American listeners, right? So Sean Mutagi of Vegan Reich, crazy kind of, I guess, anarcho, left-wing, fascist, 90s, vegan supremacist band. I'm not really sure how to describe their politics because I would not call them fascist. There's a lot of things I would call them that might be unflattering, but fascist isn't quite the word, but I also am not sure what else to say. So we talked about how he formed a reggae band. It's basically Vegan Reich playing white reggae music. Mutagi's not strictly speaking white, but the rest of the band are, and it definitely sounds like white reggae, to be honest. His new band, Violent Disorder, very specifically is a reaction to the Trump era, which, is cool. I actually think that he's doing it a little bit better. He's not necessarily doing Orange Man bad stuff like you might expect from a hardcore guy of his generation. He's certainly handling it better than Rick to Life of 25 to Life, who has just become a screwdriver guy now. Violent Disorder's whole deal is that Sean's putting out a series of albums with this band that kind of demonstrate the history of the skinhead movement from a specifically a radical, vanguard party perspective. Which is how this is relevant to our episode, is that Sean, well, he doesn't describe himself as a Marxist specifically. He does describe himself as believing in a working class vanguard party, which I gotta say, there are only a couple of ideologies that I think you can kind of pin that onto, right? Violent Disorder is him saying that the roots of what would be the working class vanguard party go through ska music and skinhead music, and he's making a series of albums detailing the history of that movement. It's a little goofy, like pretty much everything Sean does. We did a whole episode about, there's some sus things in his backlog, not sus, sketchy. Sketchy is not sus, Sean. I'm not saying that but you were sketchy at one point. Pretty interesting thing. I listened to the first single from Violent Disorder. Pretty classic, angelic upstarts, Sham 69 influenced away. But I guess the next EP is going to be a straight up ska, ska punk EP. Pretty curious to see how that goes. It could be really cool. It might be pretty cringe because you really don't know with Sean Mutagi.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, somebody who is not a fan of ska and was, I'll be honest, not the biggest fan of that Vegan Reich album we reviewed, I'm very interested to hear how this turns out because this could either turn out really interesting or not very good.
So, like I said, the first EP pretty good, especially if you're into like old school oi, like just Angelic Upstarts, that kind of melodic but aggressive street punk thing from that era. But like I said, this next EP, I guess it's gonna be ska straight up. I am musically a pretty big Vegan Reich fan, as you probably have gathered. I have complicated feelings about them ideologically. There's a lot of shit in there that I think kind of sucks. There's a lot of shit in there that I think for its time is pretty cool, and it kind of is a grab bag of weird extremist opinions from hardcore guys in the 90s.
No, absolutely. I'm very fucking excited to hear that. And you know what, Brian? Speaking of people who love ska, I think that actually leads perfectly into my cringe generational segment / cringe millennial. And this one is definitely more of a literal definition for this segment because I found somebody who I just learned after hearing the plea deal was a millennial. But Brian, I know we haven't really talked about this case, but it is extremely cringy. Are you familiar with the Moscow murders, otherwise known as the suspect Brian Koberger? Are you familiar with him at all?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so in 2022, in November of 2022, 4 college kids were murdered in the town of Moscow, Idaho at like 4 in the morning, and they were all stabbed to death in their like fucking living quarters. I think it was like a dorm room or something, or maybe like a duplex or something, or college house or whatever the fuck. And I think there were 6 people living there, and 4 of them were murdered. And the lead suspect of that case was found out pretty quickly. He was found maybe like a week or 2 after the murders. He fled back to his home state of Pennsylvania. He got arrested, they were preparing the trial and everything. And just before they were about to go to trial, he pled guilty to all 4 murders. And you may be thinking like, well, it's obviously very cringy that this guy like murdered 4 college students, right? Brian, you don't know the level of cringe I'm about to get into with this guy because this guy is like maybe one of the most cringy millennials we've maybe ever covered on the show. So
My
real
God.
quick. Oh, it's wild. So all the victims, I think, were in their like very early 20s, but Brian Koberger was, I believe, in his like mid to early 30s or something. Oh, he was a year younger than me. So yeah, he's 31, 32. From originally Pennsylvania, he was a PhD level criminology student at the local university in Moscow, Idaho. He was apparently very off-putting. Some people said he had autism. Some people said he had OCD, maybe a combination of those things. He would apparently get like very in depth with his like studies, and he was very much like the like straight A like goody two shoes like asshole student, and he was like a TA, and he would get on people's asses all the time if they said something he didn't agree with. So obviously there's a lot of interesting parallels when he would be accused of this crime, and then it's like the type of personality, very type A type personality,
a very type A, very like authoritarian who hasn't really earned that sense of authority kind of thing.
No, exactly. And even though as part of his plea agreement, he did not disclose why he committed the crime, I've had the theory for a while because that he is a PhD student, that he was trying to plan the perfect murder and he just fucked it up really bad. I think that's my theory. Because the thing is that I believe that he was only going after 1 or 2 of the victims. I think he may have had like some sort of weird like parasocial crush or like sexual fascination with one of the girls, because it was 3 girls and 1 boy that were murdered.
Yeah, you think maybe he ended up taking out a couple of people he didn't account for. Maybe it got out of hand from what he was expecting.
Yeah, exactly. Like either he was about to just commit a sexual assault and murder, or maybe just sexual assault, and her roommate woke up and then he had to like take care of it. And then like the 2 people downstairs heard about it. So he decided to just, take care of it. And like I said, there were 6 people total in this house, but 2 people didn't wake up, which I'm shocked that they didn't wake up because 4 people were brutally murdered in the span of 20 minutes. I mean, I don't know. I'm a pretty light sleeper. I would have woke up to that.
Yeah, I feel like I would have woken up. You gotta think, and I'm not saying this to be funny, it must feel awful to be those people that didn't wake up. Like, imagine the survivor guilt from that, right?
Oh, no, 100%. Yeah. And they were like all friends, apparently. Like all the 4 people that were murdered, they were like best friends. They like hung out all the time and they lived together and they were like about to graduate together. It was like a really fucking horrifying story. And the reason that he got caught was that, and I shouldn't laugh at this part because it's obviously not very funny, but he killed all these kids. He killed all these kids with a K-bar knife. And guess what? He left the sheath behind with his DNA all over it.
Awesome. Millennials remain unchallenged. Best generation.
And apparently the description of the suspect was that he was a fairly tall guy, slender with bushy eyebrows. And looking at the picture, it's like, yep, that's him. That is
He's like all eyebrows.
Yeah. He's only a little less eyebrowy than Luigi. That's the only person I can think of with comparable eyebrows.
I'm imagining like a seaside caricature artist drawing like just a face that's covered in eyebrows.
Yeah, no, it's a very fucking wild story. And, it's one of those things where, once again, like I said, he was a PhD student. He would apparently, get up other students' asses if they said something that he disagreed with. Just very type A personality. And apparently, he was, the top-level, criminology student at that university. So, yeah, my theory is that he was going to try to plan the perfect murder as basically, his unofficial, dissertation, and he just failed really bad.
His dissertation, exactly. Well, the other thing, too, is, maybe not even that he was thinking of it as his unspoken dissertation, but almost certainly, right, he was thinking, well, I have a PhD, or I'm a PhD, I can do this and get away with this because I'm such a fucking genius. For him to get caught because he left the fucking sheath there is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. It was really embarrassing. So he tried to commit the perfect murder and he just fucking ate shit at it. And, it's one of those things, too, where I'm kind of surprised he pled, because I would have thought, even though he knew for a fact, obviously, that he was going to get fucking convicted, you would think as a criminology student, he would want to, argue his case on the stand or some shit.
A criminology student who's also clearly, a narcissist, right?
100% narcissist. Yeah, 100 fucking percent.
I guess maybe him being a criminology student is, maybe he has enough sense to be well, maybe if I plea, I'll get some sort of leniency, which maybe other narcissists might not be considering.
The state were going after the death penalty, so that's the reason why he pled. But at the same time, nobody's been executed in Idaho for a decade at this point, so it's not like he would. But, obviously the fear of death will put the fear of God into anybody, obviously. But still, it's I think personally, if he really wanted to just, soothe his narcissism, he really should have just went to trial. But you know what? Obviously, I'm not him. And, good thing he didn't pursue this, but still.
You know what the fear of death puts in me is not so much a fear of God, but a fear of a profound mix of Confucianism and Marxist-Leninism that I carry with me, that pushes me forward.
And, maybe if Brian Koberger had embraced the light of Juche, maybe he wouldn't have murdered these fucking college students, possibly.
I almost have to guarantee it after watching this week's film, Taylor. I really can't draw any other conclusion. In fact, usually when I hear about a violent crime, or I see someone driving like an asshole, if someone is rude to me while I'm at work, I just think to myself, really, they should embrace Juche. They'd be much happier.
Exactly. So I think that leads perfectly into our review of Order Number 27. Now, just a real quick details, because of course there's very little to discuss in this movie, details and synopsis-wise. So this movie, I believe, came out in 1986. There's some conflicting reports on that, but that was the most accurate I could find. It was, of course, not rated by the MPA, because of course it wasn't released in the US. It was directed by Jong Ki-mo and Kim Eung-suk, who are people who had no other credits on IMDb. It was written by Ri Song-uk, which also had no credits on IMDb. It's 77 minutes long, but the version I found on YouTube was only 74 minutes, so maybe that 3 minutes is lost media. And, of course, It did not have a listed budget or box office, and it did not have an RT audience or critic score.
So I was thinking about this, because I also checked for the director and the writers, their credits. My guess upon watching this film a couple times this week is they must have been industrial filmmakers for the DPRK. Who knows? They could have done any type of movie. My guess, though, based on how this movie is made, which as a movie, just to get really clear, is fine. There's nothing wrong with it as a piece of cinema, but my guess is that they made educational films.
Yeah, educational propaganda films, basically just anything that would advance North Korea's intended message, 100% for sure. And then for the synopsis here, and obviously we're not going to get too deep in the synopsis because it's very, very basic war movie, propaganda movie, but real quick. So it's set during the Korean War. The movie's plot follows the protagonists, a group of North Korean special operations soldiers being sent across the DMZ in order to complete Order Number 27. The order has the soldiers first attack and cripple the special force, who are described as committing atrocities. Now, real quick, this one's really funny because, and to be fair, this was, of course, true. They are the atrocities unit of the U.S. military, and that one made me laugh really hard. Even though that's stupid to describe them as that way, but that is literally what they did.
Okay, but here's as good a point to get into it as any. Everyone talking about this fucking movie. And I know, given the last couple episodes, we're not beating any allegations being leveled at us by the CIA agent that listens to the show. There is nothing in this film. Well, there's a couple of things that I made note of. There is nothing in here that is substantially different from a film like The Green Berets or Sands of Iwo Jima starring John Wayne. I would argue that this film is much less sadistic than The Sands of Iwo Jima.
Or frankly, Red Dawn. This is the communist version of Red Dawn to a certain extent.
No, it absolutely is. And you'll see, listener, as we go on, came about 86, 87. I actually kept seeing 87. I don't really have any good confirmation on that. It feels, and this is not a knock, it's just an observation, like it was made 20 or 30 years earlier. Just the way that it's shot, the way it's composed, the acting choices, it feels like it's from the late 50s or early 60s.
Exactly, yeah, no. And then there's also a spy by the name or code name of Balestine, and she's a like medic or nurse or something who's a spy for the North Koreans. Honestly, the plot in this movie,
smoke show, kind of a smoke show.
Kind of a baddie if you think about it. Woo! But no, really, like the plot of this movie is very bare bones. It literally just exists as like, hey, you want to join the People's Liberation or whatever they're called in North Korea and
the
South
People's
Koreans?
Army.
Yeah, the People's Army, exactly, that's the word. But like, yeah, this movie is awesome in a lot of ways. So real quick, the action scenes in this are like some of the best action scenes I've ever seen. And you can tell they're really fucking good because you can tell there was like no like safety protocols or anything. Like these people are all kicking each other and punching each other and it's all hitting. And there's also scenes where they're like getting on trains and stuff and like one misstep and they would have gotten fucking ran over by that train. Or the guy hanging from the helicopter.
Yeah.
Oh my God, crazy.
The fucking stunt work in this film, which is so realistic, so like really happening and funny, which actually isn't specific to DPRK. You see that in Chinese action films, and of course we've talked about Hong Kong action films. That's part of the reason all these movies are so great, is because they, frankly, and ironically, in the case of the DPRK, they aren't beholden to labor laws. You straight up see people get fucking beamed in the head during fights here, like in nasty ways, where you see it and you go, ooh.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where, and this is to a lesser extent in, modern movies like The Raid, where they don't have nearly as much protection laws. But in those movies, it's like, okay, well, those people at least survived. Whereas in this movie, I don't know if everybody survived, I'm going to be honest with you. There's plenty of people who could have easily, died while making this fucking movie. I'm going to be real here.
Well, and we just don't know. There just is no information. One of the things, too, with the stunt work in this is that, and this is a pretty obvious thing, so North Korea did not need to make this movie because they are a conscription nation, but because that's part of what the People's Army studies, right? Is they study not Taekwondo, although we will be talking about YK Kim versus Juche thread. They have their own brand of kind of martial arts that's specific to Korea that the DPRK says. So these are people that had to get really good at that. They did not have a choice to be okay at hand-to-hand combat, and they were lucky enough that good enough and lucky enough that they said, oh, instead of going onto the front lines and being fodder, which is what the People's Army essentially does, right? They used to be fodder for the Soviet Union. Now they're basically fodder for Russia. You got to do what you got to do, I guess. But the guys in this movie who were probably enlisted probably did have to learn all this as military practice. Do you want to be in a movie? Do you want to look really cool for 10-year-old boys?
Yeah, versus being turned into a meat grinder in Afghanistan or whatever, or nowadays in fucking Ukraine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but yeah, and some of that stuff's really funny. And also on top of it too, the military personnel that are supposed to be the Americans committing atrocities. I watched a YouTube video that was, I'll be honest, definitely very right-wing coded, but it was describing the plot of this movie. And I didn't even realize it too, but the people who are supposed to be the bad guys in this movie are supposed to be Americans.
Yeah. But it's it's all fucking, it's Korea guys, obviously.
Well, that's the thing, Brian. You know that very famous Korean unit that only speaks Korean is full of Korean guys, that very famous unit of the American military?
I was hoping that we would see the racist version of an American accent. You know how in a 50s or 40s war movie, they'd be making the Ching Chong voice. They'd be like, howdy, partner.
Well, and that's the thing, North Korea had American defectors who were in North Korean production, so they could have gotten some of those guys. It's not like they were doing anything else. Jesus Christ.
To all of our incel listeners who are wondering why they can't get a state-sanctioned wife who will stand by them, cross the DMZ. That's what they did for all those guys.
No, really, what is that movie, Crossing the Line,
Crossing the Line.
Which is fantastic documentary if you haven't watched it. It is a very interesting documentary. And I believe, Joseph Dresnok died a decade ago, and all those guys are dead now, the original defectors, but either way. And then also
I think the last defector was this is relevant, that's why I'm saying it, the black guy that was stationed in South Korea that crossed the DMZ because he was upset by racism in the U.S. military, and they sent him back.
Oh, yes, I did hear about that.
They held on to him for 3 weeks, and then they just sent him back.
Yeah. And then another element of this movie is really interesting too is that, and I learned that from that, like I said, pretty right-wing video that I watched. But either way, they described some of the weaponry in this movie, and most of the weaponry and tanks in this movie are either obviously like Soviet weaponry and stuff like that, which makes sense because North Korea was, essentially propped up by the Soviet Union, especially, throughout most of its early existence. They also had a couple more than likely captured during like the Korean War, like American weaponry that was used in this movie. Like I think the helicopter was.
They used the same gun like throughout the movie for different people, different American soldiers using this one gun they clearly had.
Yeah, and apparently that's like a World War II era weapon. So that's also very interesting. Although that would make sense for the Korean War setting of this movie.
But that's what they would have ended up with. One of the things about this movie, so I know we got to get to the synopsis. So last week when we talked about
Oh no, Brian, that is the synopsis basically.
Oh, good,
no synopsis.
Good. So we talked last week about Come and See, and we spoke a little bit about it as kind of a deconstruction of social realism, right? So Come and See takes like these traditions of Soviet art and, broader existing communist art or formerly existing communist art in the case of the very dignified worker, the dignified soldier, the dignified laborer, the dignified peasant, the dignified artist working in concert. That's the whole thing. And Come and See, I do think is in a self-aware way kind of showing a late stage, like an inversion of that, kind of a fractured version of social realism. This is made in about the same time within a couple of years of Come and See, and this is a hyper nostalgic, almost cartoonishly social realist coded movie or like aesthetically movie.
Yes, in fact, as you mentioned with like the socialist realism thing, like honestly this movie is kind of visually beautiful in a lot of ways, like especially the scenes where they like show the entire unit or whatever and there's like a sunset in the background or like the sun is rising or stuff like that. Like honestly there's some like actually like picturesque, like painting-esque scenes in this movie that could easily be on like like a fucking Soviet or obviously like DPRK era like mural or whatever. It's really fascinating. Like you don't see that in American movies. You just don't.
Well, no, what you see, okay, so let's think of, because I don't want to sit here and say this movie isn't propaganda. Of course it is. But is it like significantly more propagandistic than, again, like the Green Berets? One of the ugliest movies you've ever seen. But I do think the emotions it's trying to elicit. And whether this is in good faith, whether this is genuine, we can argue about. The emotions that like Green Berets, starring John Wayne, is supposed to elicit is kind of, I think, like, I don't want to give this movie too much credit. Kind of a pride in the nastiness of Vietnam and like manifest destiny. At least the idea of this movie that it's trying to visually represent is this idea of like dignified self-determination, which is like what Juche is all about. It's what it purports to be all about. So you get really visually striking shots. Of course, everyone is like very, it's not a Hollywood movie, but everyone is like very like chisel jaw, kind of classic old Hollywood handsome guys, which I don't think is what most special units in any military look like.
Not really, no. And then also I do want to mention real quick too, so even though obviously there's no American equivalent really of like socialist realism in like art, but a really good example of the Western equivalent of that is the Love Like Blood music video from the band Killing Joke, which definitely displays that. And I think that was the first time I ever saw that. I'm like, what is this art style I'm not familiar with? And then there's that. In fact, there's some pretty obvious overtures in that fucking music video, but either way, that's probably the closest I can think of from a Western perspective.
And you'll see a lot of 80s or early 90s punk bands, like Western punk bands, using like socialist realism art. Usually ironically, sometimes not. You've got a band like Killdozer from Madison, Wisconsin, used a lot of socialist realism art on their album covers, which is really funny because if you listen to Killdozer, they are not like this like dignified revolutionary band. They're like a sleazy noise rock band that say things like, I could make a better hamburger with my asshole.
Yeah, that's fucking hilarious. Oh, and then just real quick for the synopsis, like I said, even though I described some very basic tenets, so yeah, basically, once again, this military unit, they get together, they're told that they're going to go in the DMZ, they meet with the spy Balestine, and she gets horribly, like, maimed, but she lives, and there's a lot of action scenes going on, and then the last scene in the movie is there's, like, this really awesome, like, battle scene in the Dongjam Bay or whatever. I don't know where that is in Korea, I didn't even look that up. But either way, and then the, like, captain of the crew, like, gets on this helicopter at the very end and blows himself up and blows the helicopter up as, like, a last heroic act. At the end of the movie, it's basically a call to action, like fight for the homeland, fight for the fatherland, and then the movie ends. That's basically the entire plot.
It's a collection of set pieces. There's set pieces about how cool the People's Army Special Forces are, how noble they are, and how much they love each other, how much they love their families, and how much they love their country. And then really incredible martial arts sequences that go on for pretty long stretches of time and are pretty brutal. Like these guys are kicking each other's asses.
Yes, and I think that comes perfectly to our comparison and companion piece movie to this. So the companion piece that I can think of that most exemplifies this is not Come and See, even though those were both made under communist governments, but is, of course, Miami Connection. Now, obviously, ideologically, they're not even remotely comparable movies, but one is a Korean-American movie and the other is a North Korean film. One is expounding the values of Juche and self-reliance and, to a certain extent, communism, although communism hasn't actually been used in the North Korean constitution at this point for decades, but either way, whatever. And then the individualist, how the best way I can describe it, the optimistic version of capitalism and friendship that Miami Connection offers to the world.
That's absolutely it. Is that YK Kim is a true believer in the
motivational.
Yeah, motivational. Yeah, in the capitalist system. That's a guy that believes he has seen his country as he sees it prosper through kind of U.S. aid and U.S. backing, and it's I really truly believe the point of Miami Connection, right, is YK Kim going, I need to show American teenagers how great their country is. I need to make them see how cool America is.
Yeah, you need to see how cool America is. If you just are willing to work and fight and you will get everything you want. In North Korea, it's we need to kill the American invaders by any means necessary.
It's almost like a funhouse mirror of Miami Connection, where it's we need kids to see how noble their life is and how dignified they can be and how proud their family will be of them if they fight. Whereas Miami Connection is you're going to have so much fun if you fight and you're going to see hot babes in bikinis. They both ultimately are, propagating this idea aimed at, I think Order Number 27 is more aimed at children, preteen boys and early teen boys, whereas Miami Connection is probably later teenagers. But it's both this idea that following this path, it looks really cool and it's really action packed. And this is a noble type of war that on either side that we are presenting.
Absolutely. No, yeah. So, and I remember when you offered to have us review this, I'm just oh, what could we relate this to? And I'm oh, literally it's Miami Connection. This is the polar opposite sibling of fucking Miami Connection.
Yeah.
I'm this is perfect. This is absolutely fucking perfect.
And in the most literal way, Taylor, when we were talking about this over the course of the week, you pointed out the actual, the martial arts techniques in Miami Connection, very good, right? We talked about that on the episode. YK Kim, quite skilled, not only as a martial artist, but as a trainer and as a teacher, he seems to be pretty skilled. So you see a lot of good technique in Miami Connection. Not always super engaging to watch, in my opinion. Order Number 27, I would say, as far as I can tell, the stunt work, the martial arts, seem quite good, but you don't really see so much technique as you see just this kind of bloody knuckles, balls to the wall, guys beating the shit out of each other. There's very little emphasis on communicating technique to the audience. Whereas I think YK Kim felt that it was more important to show the technique than to make people feel like the fight looked cool, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a lack of balance in both these movies in a certain way. But Order Number 27, the lack of balance is so balls to the wall, fucking wild, that it's very fascinating to watch. Because, yeah, obviously it's not quite Taekwondo, I don't think. But just, it's how the best way you can describe it. There's almost some fucking capoeira moments in this where I'm what the fuck is this martial art? Especially in the, village one where, Balestine gets, sought after. It's a fucking Wild West scene or whatever. And there's one moment where one of the guys takes his leg and wraps it around a guy's head and fucking throws him with his legs. And I'm that's just capoeira. That's wild to me.
The martial arts in Order Number 27 are so ungraceful. And that's not to say that they look unskilled or that they aren't impressive to see, but it's so not about grace. It is so I'm pretty sure that the actors in this movie really had to learn this skill set probably in a military context. And they did it to kick people's asses. And then they basically were made to do that to each other in front of a camera.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting you talk about how the not graceful thing, because the entire like character motivation is about grace and dignity and respect.
Yeah.
And then they're just like going like fucking like Street Fighter nut shit going on. It's
Well,
wild.
well, Taylor, a revolution is not a tea party. It is not painting a picture or writing an essay or doing embroidery. I can't remember what Mao says. It cannot be so refined.
Exactly. Yeah, but no, this movie is 100% fucking worth watching, in my opinion. It is free on YouTube, of course. The subtitles, I don't think are fully accurate. I mean, I don't know that. I don't fucking speak Korean.
No, but there's some goofy shit in there.
So yeah, I don't know 100% for sure, obviously, but you know, if you have time to fucking watch this movie and just like turn your brain off, and even if you're not a Jucheist, you're not a DPRK communist when they were still actually preaching communism, I would still recommend watching this movie because it is just a fucking awesome movie, like straight up. Well, it's only 75 minutes, once again. It's very short.
It's a TV movie. So for the most part, I don't think that this as a piece of propaganda is mostly egregious. We always say at Millennials Are Old that we take art on its own terms. Like that's very important, I think, to both Taylor and myself. You take art on its own terms, you judge it on those terms, and then you judge it outside of those terms. But first, you need to take it for what it is. For the most part, I don't really feel that creeped out by the propaganda level on this, because again, there's so many American analogs to this, and a lot of them feel as hateful or more hateful than this. There is one funny scene. One of the quote-unquote American villains, their commander, is being relayed to how the People's Army, special forces, have destroyed these American soldiers. And at one point, the American commander says, what, they weren't fighting over food? The implication here being, of course, because this would have been made right before the Great Famine, right? So this is before the famine in North Korea, but probably by the late 80s, they weren't receiving a ton of aid from the Soviet Union, and there probably wasn't an abundance of extra food, right? So here, this movie is made, and we've got an American villain saying, they're not fighting over food the way that the Americans do, almost like he expects that because that's what American troops would do, right? And that was the one moment where I felt like I was being propagandized a little too egregiously.
No, I know exactly what you mean when it comes to like the propaganda part of this movie, right? Like you talk about the Great Famine that happened in the 90s, right? Like, the thing is that as far as we're aware of, because obviously North Korea, it's called the Hermit Kingdom. A lot of information does or doesn't get out. Most of the information you hear in the West about North Korea is either wrong or grossly exaggerated. And I'm not saying this as like a defender of North Korea, but like if you claim to be a quote unquote North Korea expert, like Americans can't even fucking go to North Korea. So like how much of an expert can you be if you can't even go to the fucking country you claim to be an expert in? But hey, whatever, right? But like at the same time, North Koreans, as far as I'm aware of, are propagandized to believe that North Korea is like the best country in the world. Like everything rocks there, everything's cool, everything's great. So like if shit goes bad in North Korea, like imagine how much worse it is in every other country. So I wouldn't be surprised if North Koreans, like even during their famine, they're like, God, we can't eat and some of our people are dying. Like how are there any Americans left?
And part of that, there's some discussion about that from kind of an internationalist left perspective, is that people of a certain age who are all, mostly dead now will remember kind of what they were propagandized about, like America and about capitalist countries to believe. And they have enough knowledge of kind of the Korean War, what they observed and what they experienced, about America, that when they're told, which they are told, as far as I know, it is true, yeah, that the DPRK tells their citizens that they send food to America to aid citizens. I've heard some conflicting reports on that, but things like that seem to be true. Yeah, I would assume that, especially when the Soviet Union fell and everything got really bad, probably the default opinion was, we're so lucky to be here. Everything must be so bad in America because of the wealth disparity there.
No, exactly. Yeah. And, going back to the documentary Crossing the Line, there's a scene in that where they ask Joseph Dresnok about the Great Famine. And his line was essentially like, I'll just say that I was fed very well. I did not experience any of that, which is interesting, right? Because obviously, North Korea has a big hate boner for the U.S., which once again, we totally understand. They killed like a quarter of their fucking population during the Korean War. But at the same time, it's interesting, right? That even in North Korea, a white American has white privilege, that he got to eat just fine while his countrymen starved. Isn't that wild to think about?
Yeah, that is, I've never heard it framed quite that way, but that's absolutely correct. Having those defectors there was such a useful bargaining chip, especially by the 90s. Because in the 70s, there were kind of quite a few defectors. Up until about the Reagan era, you had a fair amount of defectors to all kinds of communist countries. You had Americans that went to go live in North Korea, including some of the Black Panthers for a time in the early 70s. You had people that went to go live in Vietnam, a lot of people that went to go live in the Soviet Union. But by 1993 or whatever, 1995, for North Korea to have any like American defectors, that for them, maybe not so much to the rest of the world, but towards their own people, that was such a boon as, quote unquote, proof of the success of their system. Now, whether or not it's fair to say that their system has failed, like, I don't know, but that's absolutely why they want those defectors so bad. They love, like, I'm sure you know about Kim Jong-un and Dennis Rodman and how well Dennis Rodman gets treated there and how he comes back and he says there's no racism in North Korea. It doesn't exist there.
No, exactly. Yeah. Like it's one of those things. And, talk about the survival of North Korea. Like North Korea, people have been saying forever, like the regime is weakened, but North Korea is not going to go away anytime soon. They are a nuclear power. There's essentially no internal dissent in the country at all. Like the power is very much coalesced and converged on the Kims for decades and generations now at this point. Like they have the world's fourth largest military, and there's no question whether they're going to fucking mutiny or not, as far as I'm aware of. Like people are always like, oh, they're just one fucking whatever. But like the truth is that their isolation has really helped them survive more than anybody else. They have done the thing that basically almost every other communist state has failed to do.
Yeah, and regardless of what you want to say about that, that is where like the Soviet Union failed towards the end. I just don't see that happening with North Korea because, like you said, internally, it's hard to use the word popular when you're talking about, a one-party state that's propagandized, totalitarian rule. But I mean, people do, and you can say it's because they're brainwashed or whatever, but they fucking love the Kims. They're raised their whole lives to think about the Kims as like they're the lifeblood of their country and of their families, Like if there was internal instability in North Korea, like leading to like potential for a coup, we would be hearing about it. We absolutely would be hearing about it.
Exactly. You wouldn't hear, and nowadays we hear about the occasional trickle of like defectors or whatever, but you're not seeing like hundreds of thousands of people defecting. You're not hearing that at all. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. That's almost certainly probably a bad thing, to be honest with you in some ways. But like at the same time, you're not hearing about that. There's a reason why that fucking weird skinny lady with all those horrible like fucking facial plastic surgery things going on goes on Joe Rogan and just lies all the time. And she's like that's the only defector you fucking hear about. Like seriously. So yeah, it's one of those things where, and even though obviously North Korea is, as far as we're aware of, is by modern standards a pretty underdeveloped, almost like borderline pre-modern society in some ways, especially in like the rural areas. But like once again, the fact that there's not like mass exoduses out of the country does say something about their overall stability.
And part of the thing with, them being kind of stuck in time, part of that is just related to the fall of the Soviet Union. So much of their technology, so much of the education that was shared with them, so much of the medicine that was shared with them was because they had, maybe wouldn't necessarily say an ally, but they had a sympathetic ear in the USSR for a long time. There are, obviously if you watch this movie, you see there are people with like skills in North Korea. There are people who spend a lot of time on a craft that isn't just like marching in a military parade. The problem with that is that all of that sort of calcified in like the early 80s, which is really the last time that they were close to another country. You could say now they're becoming close again to Russia, but not the way that they were close to the USSR. So aesthetically, even when you look at the urban areas of North Korea, they have this kind of hauntological quality, right? They have almost like a Mark Fisher quality where they look like they're from like 1978, even the new buildings, because that's the type of architecture they've studied. They don't have some other kind of architecture. If you watch pirated television from North Korea, it all looks like daytime TV from like the earlier mid-90s now. The Kims are seeing whatever culture they want. But in terms of like what people are learning there and observing from, even if they're really good at their craft, it's all things from that era when they still had sort of an international community that they really don't have at all now. I think that also goes a long way to explaining why this movie, which is a well-made, I think, and a pretty enjoyable action movie, even though it's propaganda, it's pretty sweet at moments, I think. It's pretty endearing, but that's also probably goes a long way to explaining why it was made in 1986 and looks like it was made in 1960, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. 100%. And, I think we've said quite a bit on the sort of ideological stances and how we compare this to capitalist media and stuff like that. Do we have any final thoughts, Brian, before we get to our pluggables in the episode?
It's a fun action adventure movie. It is military propaganda, so you need to be aware of that. I would say if you can watch like an older John Wayne movie that's well made and divorce yourself from that, though, there's no reason you can't do the same for this for the most part. Also, I'm going to say some of the martial arts in this film, they're excellent. excellent. Like, I really think, I'm not going to say it's some of the best ever. There's a lot of great, like, classic martial arts from the 70s and 80s. But if you're a fan of just, like, cool martial arts stunt work, this film really does offer a lot. These action scenes are extremely memorable.
No, I totally agree with everything there. And yeah, it's one of those things where I'm not super familiar with North Korean cinema. You know, I am a big fan of South Korean cinema and, you know, their sort of, I guess, Asian interpretations of, I think, a lot of European tropes. But North Korean cinema and art, as far as I understand, is kind of a hodgepodge of basically everything. And this movie is definitely
a lot of comedies. They make a lot of comedies over there, as far as I can tell.
I mean, this movie does have some comedic moments, obviously, in between the ass beatings and the almost certainly people getting horribly maimed and dying literally on set stuff going on here.
I think the thing that this has in common with, like, the comedies, and they make a lot of, like, dramas, varying degrees of seriousness to them in the ones I've seen, but really what the regime likes and what the film industry there likes, and presumably what the people like, I guess, because they have to, is very light fare that makes you feel good to see. They are pretty big fans, or they make a lot of all kinds of, like, basic, like, broad genres. They make a lot of horror there. They make a lot of action adventure. They make a lot of rom-coms. Rom-coms are really big there. And there's a school of thought that actually goes back, I mean, it's probably older than him. Goebbels was a big believer. I'm not trying to say that the DBRK are, you know, I'm not trying to draw, like, some horseshoe theory principle here, but it does it's kind of illuminating in this regard. Goebbels always said that the best propaganda, especially in film, wasn't really heavy fare. It was light films full of attractive people acting pleasant, where the ideology was kind of, like, interloped in, right? And I think that's what they do a lot there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just a real quick tangent. I know obviously that, you know, was it Kim Jong-il? Yeah, Kim Jong-il was a really big, like, cinephile, and he had an entire filmmaking philosophy that was very much alongside, like, very Juche ideology of North Korea as well.
So just real quick, because it is kind of interesting. Kim Jong-il's, his contribution, if you want to call it that, to Juche, which means his contribution then to the broader, like, Marxist-Leninist conversation, but, you know, very specifically to Juche, is his theories on film, which if you read it, he has books about how he thinks film should be made, what he thinks the revolutionary potential for film is, and that is reflected in every single film that is made in the DPRK. It's crazy.
It is. And, you know, one of these days we will certainly get into more North Korean cinema because it's obviously a treasure trove of information, apparently what you said. But you know what, Brian? I think with that ends our review for this week. So speaking of people who propagate propaganda, let's get into our pluggables here. So you can follow us and subscribe to us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, of course, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert are creating a fantastic series. A series that has nothing to do with Juche ideology, to be very clear. But it is a very ambitious series as well. You know, they have one episode out on YouTube. They're in pre-production for subsequent episodes. They have a GoFundMe, which I believe is about a quarter of the way through their funding goal at the very moment. But they need more of our moral and financial support to continue their series off the ground. And, you know, as we always talk about too, you know, if you send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just show us proof that you donated. We will, within reason, match those donations because we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to become a reality. And then, Brian, do you have any updates?
We're waiting. We're at the same spot we were. Sean, I think, is finished healing. They're tweaking the script still. They're still aiming for, what did they say? I think, you know, I check in with Scott periodically. They're still aiming to shoot in, I think he said, the last week of September or the first week of October.
Cool.
Which to me seems late for Oregon, but, you know, whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, Brian, you only lived there for a decade. How the fuck do you know anything? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that seems like it's pretty late, but I don't know.
Yeah. And then, you know, speaking of people who are actually revolutionary, unintentionally because they didn't do it, but, you know, Luigi Mangione, otherwise known as the United Healthcare CEO shooting suspect, but of course we don't believe he did it. But either way, he is, you know, currently coming up on trial probably within the next few months. He has a defense fund, the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund. It's now been official for probably the better part of the year already at this point. I think since like fucking January or something. But either way, of course, you know, we believe in Luigi. We believe he's innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. Not even not guilty, just completely innocent beyond beyond a reasonable doubt. There's been so much judicial misconduct in this case. There's no way this could possibly be a fair trial at the very moment. So we need to give him all of our moral and quite possibly financial support as well, so we can stick it to the man and basically tell them to fuck off. Because, Brian, even though he has the best shot of winning a lot of these cases, but, the Trump administration, they're becoming more fascist every day. They're becoming more authoritarian. They're, talking about deporting American citizens at this point. Like, it's one of those things where, like, we need to stand up for everybody who's being railroaded by the criminal justice system. And Luigi is definitely part of that in any way possible, either social media, financially, however.
And that is the revolutionary act that is supporting Luigi. If he's not guilty, we know that they've pinned an inconvenient death on just some guy. What is revolutionary is the groundswell of support that organically rose up for him that they all see, and now they have to pin it on him now that they see all the support he's getting.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and, just like with the Lucifer and the Father campaign, if you, just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just, showing us that you donated, we will within reason match those donations. And both Brian and I have donated to Luigi Mangione Defense Fund, so we definitely do believe and agree with it. And like I said, we just need to show any love. And if you can't afford to send him any money, which, of course is 2025, we're talking about putting 100% fucking tariffs on the BRICS countries or whatever the fuck, shit's going bad. If you can't afford that, just post positively about him on YouTube. Call him hot, call him cool, just talk about how innocent he is.
Send
him
a letter.
Anything. Send him a letter, 100%. If you're Latinas or, big booty Ebonies for Luigi, talk about it to him. Tell him about your fantasies.
Talk about him to us. You can send us your letters about Luigi. We'll talk about Luigi with you.
Exactly. So, yes, please send us tasteful nudes that we will send to Luigi. Actually, don't do that, please. We will not accept those. Even dick pics, which I do admit I probably would laugh at, but we will not.
I will accept very juche dick pics.
Socialist realism dick pics.
Yes. Very dignified, empowered looking dicks.
By the way, socialist realist, gay porn, that has to be a thing, 100%.
Oh, I'm sure. No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, you know what? I'm going to look it up. I'm going to be careful with my... Hang on. Before we go, social realism, Tom of Finland.
Yes. Well, speaking of people who are very into socialist realism and gay porn, we as well have a Patreon page. So please become a patron today. We have several tiers. I would say our best value at the very moment is the $5 tier, which is the tier where you get every episode 48 hours early, because as I always say, the first 48 hours are the most important. And that's what Brian Koberger believed too, but that clearly didn't work out for him very well.
I have bad news on the social realism Tom of Finland front. All the results I'm getting are either U.S. Navy officers or they're German SS Tom of Finland guys. They're not showing me any communist Tom of Finland here.
Well, that's the thing, though, Brian, is that Tom of Finland was Finnish, so he was a Nazi collaborator, so why would he have social realism?
But you would think that someone in that would have made it in that art style, right?
I suppose so, yes. Probably not Tom of Finland himself, because Finland is very reactionary. They were one of the only countries that freely joined. I think they were the only country that freely joined in Operation Barbarossa. So very reactionary country.
That's insane. So
yeah,
you heard about this Nazi sleeper cell thing, and we're like, oh, we want in.
Finland are definitely underrated baddies in World War II for sure. Holy shit. They don't get enough. I'm
looking at some underrated baddies right now. I'll tell you what.
Ooh. Yeah, so speaking of underrated baddies, I think that ends our episode for this week. So, Brian, this movie's called Order Number 27. I have an order very soon from my superiors that I need to go to sleep, and I will sleep for approximately 27 minutes because I have mild insomnia.
I am going to be going to bed and dreaming of a very dignified, very solemn, very liberated rest before I get up and I go to my job that I perform arduously and with great care and with great joy for my nation.
Exactly, 100%. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight. And the Kims definitely won't bite. They will do whatever you need from them, but you must do for them first. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight. And the Kims love you. They will always love you, and you must love Kim as well. For the glory of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea.
For the glorious Millennials Are Old podcast signs off to you. Please pledge to us your support monetarily and also through your undying love and allegiance.
Absolutely. So have a good night, everybody.